as good as the next man's.
No dogs, no women, no children, and no pickpockets.
I ain't no thief!
Wherever there's a crowd, you're working your game, you're cheating.
It is an interesting story how this short film developed. We were preparing to shoot a bare-knuckle boxing scene taking place in 18th century London, and we were trying to portray a diverse urban crowd of that era. We wanted to keep the process simple, picking extras based on looks, then inviting them to a scheduled costume fitting. Christopher was one of the people who had responded to our ad and who we had picked. So I was writing him an email telling him when to come in for his costume fitting. And while I was writing this email to him, I came across something my assistant and I had missed. Christopher's disclosure about his disability, that he depends on a wheelchair. There were apparent and obvious reasons a wheelchair couldn't be in this scene. For one thing, I would have to track down a historically accurate vintage wheelchair, whatever that looked like. So I had to tell him no, but I figured he deserved a personal courtesy call about it. So I called him up, and as soon as I got him on the phone, he's being very persistent and explaining to me all the ways he can be in this crowd scene. He says, I can be sitting down in a regular chair when I'm cheering and so on. And I'm like, well, you would be the one guy sitting down. Everyone else would be standing. So that would draw unnecessary attention with people wondering, well, why is this one guy sitting down? But he's still being very persistent. Keep in mind, at the time, this was just to be part of a crowd. So I couldn't even really understand why he wanted to do this so badly. But he was one of the applicants who had attached a resume, so I looked at it, and it became clear to me that he intended this to be more than a hobby. He had invested a lot of time doing this sort of thing, extra work, and he took it seriously. Knowing how much of a struggle this profession was in the first place, even for actors who are fully physically able, I started to think, okay, maybe I can accommodate this somehow. I said I'd get back to him. I said I'd think about how I could use him in the crowd. If I could get a brief shot of him on crutches, it would make sense that then he sits down the rest of the time. So I had just found the most obscure reason that now I would have to craft a prop that previously was completely unnecessary, an antique crutch. But that's actually when this whole thing took an interesting turn. I looked up on the internet for what an 18th century crutch would look like, and I came across some book about the handicapped in 18th century England. And this book is telling me that at the time, the handicapped, or crippled is what they were called then, were a fairly despised and distrusted class of people, even to the extent that in fiction, if an author wanted to portray someone as having particular nefarious character, they might be identified by giving that person some sort of disability, deformity, a limp, a crutch, so you would know this is the bad guy in the story. People who were visibly disabled. They seemed to be nearly everywhere, out on the streets, begging. And you have to remember, this wasn't the century with lots of data entry clerk jobs, customer service, telemarketing jobs, stuff like that, right? Most jobs, even if it wasn't hard manual labor, still required fully able-bodied person. And if you were born with a physical disability and weren't wealthy enough for an education, and most people weren't, this was the one monetary activity you were relegated to, begging for money from strangers on the street. And to make it worse, you were competing against other beggars who were faking their disability. And this made people who were honestly handicapped very bitter, sometimes visibly angry. understandably so. And ironically, this was one more stereotype about them, that they were angry, and so people were afraid of them. There were actual warnings in newspapers and tourist pamphlets sometimes on how to look out for and avoid people who were visibly disabled. Not out of any kind of social discomfort, but because maybe they're going to do something to you, hit you with their crutch or something. So after reading all this, I got the idea to add a few lines where this young disabled man wants to get in to see this fight just like everyone else, but is being treated unfairly by the doorman. Christopher watched YouTube clips, and Peter Zolchenko, who played the doorman, he'd call Christopher on the phone a few times a week, and they would have conversations about whatever in Cockney accent. And by the shooting day, Christopher is speaking in this accent. He was very down to earth, laid back. He was so relaxed and friendly, just giving and taking jokes with the other actors. And then when the camera turned on, it was like a switch, and he immediately became so intense and focused. Basically all business about what he was supposed to do. It kind of reminded me of the way people talk about an athlete who leaves all their effort on the field. That's the way he went about doing this. And so after looking over the footage, I had to put as much of him in the scene as possible, and ended up with this short film. So it's really because of his persistence that I have this particular short film in the first place, because I never would have read or investigated to this extent. I never would have learned what I learned. I wouldn't have written what I wrote. Christopher is the kind of actor who, after working with him one time, you immediately start thinking about all the other roles you could use him for. And I hope I get the opportunity to use him for other roles, especially as other people start taking notice and his career develops.